The following is a presentation of New Worker Radio on WZRD Chicago, bringing you national and international updates from a worker's perspective. If you're outraged over high costs of living, low wages, soaring rents, and the stress of navigating day-to-day life, consider the CWP USA in order to fight for a real change. Learn more and sign up at cwp-usa.org or newworker.us. And now, onto our program presented by Manolis.
In our first story, we bring to you a message from the Communist Workers Platform of the USA for the new year. 2026 is here. To the workers and peoples of our country, we wish you an energetic and militant new year. To the workers of all nationalities, to the families who have been affected by the kidnappings and raids of ICE, to the students and activists in the street for the liberation of Palestine, and those who mobilized in the cities across the U.S. to condemn the imperialist aggression against Venezuela, to the striking workers in healthcare, to the workers of Starbucks and Amazon who struggle for better conditions and higher wages, to the workers, the tenants, who have been organizing for lower rents and improved living conditions, to each and every worker who is subjected daily to the terrorism of their employer and their constant encroachment on their right to life, to the youth and women of the working class, and to all those who are affected by the racist violence of police terror. It is to all of you that we extend our optimism, our solidarity, and commitment for 2026 and the years to come. The Communist Workers Platform stands with you. Stemming from our scientific world outlook, we believe that this world, which is on fire all around us, in this system that is rotting and coming closer to a dead end, that all of us together have the power to change the course of history, to become the protagonists ourselves, to turn this all around for the benefits of our lives, our friends, and our families. Together, there lies hope for a new world, a better tomorrow for us and our children, and this path is the only one worth the continued struggle and every sacrifice. This past year has highlighted the widening gap between how people could live and the growth of science and technology. The achievements of human labor and thought are shackled in the chains of capital, put into operation for higher profits. The continued slowdown of the international economy is highlighting the crisis-ridden system, its inability to find profitable outlets for capital, signaling the intent of the ruling class to go to war and plunge humanity into worldwide bloodshed and slaughter. It has been confirmed that no proposal for the management of the capitalist system can override the laws of capitalism, which leads to wars, crises, and misery. This is why the world is now heating up. The rivalry between the big imperialist powers is sharpening. Billions of dollars every day are being channeled into military equipment, and war are cuts from social spending, leaving us with the inability to afford our basic needs. The Trump and Biden administrations are both culprits, and they have made countless attempts to silence our demands. For this reason, the CWP USA continues into 2026 to gather the opponents of the governments of all stripes and to orient our anger towards the path of overthrowing this rotten system and its state. Now is the time to intensify our struggles, to reiterate that we need the Communist Party to achieve this historical necessity. Our path must be to build an independent, revolutionary alternative, one that gives people hope in the face of the struggles ahead and puts the common tools in their hands, not only to resist the chaos that surrounds us, but to finally end it. The socialist revolution is that solution, but this can only be accomplished with a strong Communist Party. That is the alternative that we need. This is the objective that the CWP USA iterates when it says, onwards towards the reorganization of the Communist Party and the Socialist Revolution. And now, for international and national news, we look at the U.S. imperialist attack on Venezuela. Serbia was ruled by an authoritarian leader who committed genocide. Iraq had a dictator and chemical weapons. Afghanistan had the Taliban and drugs. Syria also had a dictatorial regime. So did Libya. Iran was bombed because it is ruled by authoritarian mullahs and wants to acquire nuclear weapons. Every imperialist intervention had an identical pretext: the overthrow of authoritarian regimes in the name of freedom and democracy of the people. It does not take much to understand that there is no crime that imperialism cannot commit to secure its interests in the territory of antagonisms that are intensifying without precedent. A look at the countries that have been bombed, massacred, enslaved, and disintegrated by imperialist intervention in just the last few years is enough to reveal the big picture of the criminal policies of the United States and its allies. The peoples of Latin America know this best, having experienced brutal military interventions, coups d'etats, pressures, and blackmail, and now the U.S. is bleeding the people of Venezuela. With this same pattern now unfolding in Venezuela, it is certain that the chapter opened by the U.S. imperialist intervention with the support of the European and British imperialists will cause a domino effect in the region and beyond. With all the cynical comments made by Trump and other figures of this administration, the putschist character of this state, its denial of the self-determination of a people, and political blackmail are all on open display. What has also been made clear is that this war has material interests. The military aggression, the kidnapping of the president, and the planned political transformation of Venezuela are directly linked to access to resources. The aim, with Europe and Britain's shameless whitewashing and complicity, their support and legitimization of Washington's bombs, is not only a war for oil, despite Venezuela's enormous oil reserves that the U.S. is after. The U.S. aim is control over resources, energy wealth, control over markets, control over geopolitical spaces, and control over who is allowed to govern, especially as it relates to countering U.S. main competitors in the hemisphere, that is, China and Russia. The intervention of the United States did not just arrive out of nowhere. It has been another link in the chain of imperialist rivalries that are reflected in the dozens of open war fronts across the world. For weeks, the U.S. has been deploying forces throughout the Caribbean and Latin America. Its plan, as outlined in Trump's so-called U.S. national security strategy, is the use of military force to reestablish the dominance of U.S. monopolies in the Western Hemisphere. From this, it is no coincidence that following the brutal bombings of Caracas, resulting in the loss of dozens of lives, that the U.S. is again launching direct threats against Iran, Cuba, and Colombia. Condemning the dirty intervention and showing solidarity with the Venezuelan people and workers and all other peoples is a front-line internationalist duty. And this is why the Communist Workers Platform reiterates the necessity for the workers and people of the United States to demand the complete closure and withdrawal of U.S. military bases and troops from across the world, including the Caribbean, and to call for the termination of all military agreements and alliances. We call on the workers and people of the United States to condemn this new imperialist intervention, to connect the struggles in solidarity with the Venezuelan people to the need to topple the capitalist system, which requires endless war. The fight to end capitalism is the fight to end war. In our next story, we now take a look at the bloody history of U.S. interventions in brief. The U.S. history of imperialism is identified with interventions and wars, both in the American continent and in the rest of the world throughout the 20th century, and continues today, with the latest so-called episode being the brutal attack on Venezuela. The intervention in Guatemala in 1954 to overthrow the democratically elected president Jacobo Arbenz by the CIA, with the reason being to stop the nationalization of landowners' land, which was harming the interests of the American company United Fruit Company, is the first military intervention on the continent. It was preceded, of course, by the intervention in Korea from 1950 to 1953, which also saw the participation and support of European countries. This was followed in April 1961 by the failed intervention of 1,400 CIA mercenaries in the Chiron Peninsula in the Bay of Pigs in Cuba to overthrow the revolutionary government led by Fidel Castro, which constitutes the first resounding defeat of U.S. imperialism on the continent. While the U.S. war in Vietnam was ongoing from 1961 to 1975, which would be another resounding defeat, in 1965, U.S. Marines landed in the Dominican Republic during a civil war that broke out between supporters of the democratically elected President Juan Bosch and the junta of Rafael Trujillo, as then U.S. President Lyndon B. Johnson feared the possibility of the Dominican Republic becoming a second Cuba. Throughout the 1970s, the U.S., as part of what was known Operation Condor, supported military dictatorships in Chile with Pinochet, Argentina, Videla, Uruguay, Stroessner, and Peru, Velázquez, and a series of military regimes in Brazil and Bolivia. In 1979, the Sandinista uprising in Nicaragua overthrew dictator Anastasio Somoza, and the United States, under President Ronald Reagan, supported the Contras with millions of dollars. The U.S. also supported the bloody response to the 1980 to 1992 Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front (FMLN) rebellion in El Salvador. The intervention in Grenada would follow in 1983 under the pretext of protecting American citizens after the overthrow of Prime Minister Maurice Bishop and the construction of an international airport at Point Salines with the help of Cuban engineers, which was presented as a so-called possible military base. In 1989, the U.S. intervened in Panama against then-President Manuel Noriega, who was accused of drug trafficking just as the Trump administration did against Maduro. In Venezuela itself, after Hugo Chavez came to power, the U.S., supporting the reactionary opposition, unsuccessfully attempted to overthrow Chavez in April 2002, taking him prisoner and appointing the industrialist leader Pedro Carmona as president for 48 hours. Also, in January 2019, they attempted to install their puppet Juan Guaidó as president, whom they withdrew after a short time. And of course, the bloody course of U.S. imperialism, especially after the counter-revolutionary overthrow in the Soviet Union and other socialist countries, includes the well-known interventions in Iraq, Afghanistan, Yugoslavia, Libya, and Syria, while in 2025 alone they bombed 6 countries, that is, the United States bombed Somalia, Nigeria, Yemen, Iraq, Syria, Iran, and most recently launched attacks on ships in the Caribbean and the northeastern Pacific. And now we move into local stories, where we will focus on Philly and New York City. In recent months, the Southeastern Pennsylvania Transit Authority, otherwise known as SEPTA, has been at the center of workers' struggles, a funding crisis, service cuts, and fare hikes. Amidst turbulent contract negotiations between the Public Transit Agency and the unions, workers were faced with uncertainty regarding their wages, benefits, and safety on the job. While the Transport Workers Union Local 234 was able to reach a tentative 2-year deal and avoid the strike, crises surrounding public safety, poor labor conditions, and service cuts have plagued SEPTA, which services the Philadelphia metro area. A round of service cuts to dozens of routes was instituted in August 2025, which impacted thousands of transit workers in the neighborhoods they serve. Only a lawsuit raised against SEPTA on behalf of the affected citizens and students was able to get the routes re-implemented. However, the state is still without a resolution to the funding crisis. A system already plagued by understaffing and mismanagement, the Pennsylvania's state government worsens the transit authority when both parties propose budgets with major shortfalls, ones the taxpayers and transit workers are expected to make up for in perpetuity. These overlapping issues highlight the imperatives of the capitalist system and how it affects services and agencies deemed to be public. The executives and brass of SEPTA are paid exorbitant salaries, hundreds of thousands of dollars. At the same time, their workers are left with stagnant wages and unsafe working conditions. Transit workers are the backbone of the system. They are essential for millions of people, many of them students and commuters. The reality is that these frontline workers are still forced to fight against structural exploitation. In the temporary contract agreed upon, it includes essential measures like access to dental care, wage increases that barely trail behind inflation and only provide the employee the bare minimum of subsistence. The agreement could only be reached in the wake of the union's vote to authorize a strike, and yet their needs are still not met. The SEPTA board chair and a general manager praised the deal as fiscally responsible on the part of the workers, while the transit authority pays exorbitant amounts of money to wasteful third-party consultants and other private services. These consultants include entities such as McKinsey, which have histories of scandals regarding quality of work, ethics, and conflict of interest. Workers are disregarded and treated as costs to be cut. Meanwhile, the so-called Public Transit Authority operates like any private company, as it is already enmeshed with several of them. The workers are forced to the table by politicians from both sides of the aisle to concede on their own livelihoods. SEPTA relies on state and federal subsidies to operate and implement new projects, yet mismanagement and wasteful outsourcing have been thoroughly documented time and time again. It has narrowly avoided a strike 2 years in a row, and in both cases, the workers are expected to concede even more and act with so-called fiscal responsibility. Behind the facade, the SEPTA leaders, as well as the Pennsylvania state government, expects the workers to do more for less, while private interests loot the system and siphon as much wealth from the people as they can. The upcoming fiscal budget for SEPTA still features the elimination of 50 bus routes, 5 regional rail lines, over 20% fare increase, and a 9 p.m. curfew on rail services. The Transit Authority refers to these cuts as irreversible shrinkage. It really is the culmination of a model intended to create profit existing in contradiction with the needs of the workers and citizens they serve. The result of this model on the public is that they're expected to first fund the service with their taxes and then pay the rising fares while the quality of service deteriorates anyways. These measures do not exist in isolation. They reflect a larger pattern of disinvestment that aims to make the system dysfunctional, both for the workers and riders as well as the lawmakers. This creates a pretext for privatization. Pennsylvania politicians regularly make suggestions to make joint public-private partnerships or privatize large segments of SEPTA. They propose these as solutions to the crisis, but the intention behind them is to fragment the transit system, which will split up the workforce, weaken their unions, and allow private businesses to operate with less transparency. It is simply another method of extracting profit at the expense of families in the Philadelphia metro area. The Communist Workers Platform of the USA stands in solidarity with the transit workers and the workers everywhere, struggling against these systems of exploitation. In cases such as these, it is clear to see that the capitalist system is working as designed. Even a state-run entity which operates in the system will repress labor and prioritize profit for all private parties involved. SEPTA is not being run for efficiency. It is being guided by the hand of capital and paving the way for privatization. SEPTA is immensely important that workers, riders, and all citizens stand against the gross abuses levied against them. Transit workers provide essential services to students, workers, and healthcare facilities and the economy at large. Struggles like these highlight the necessity of organization and solidarity in purpose and action. The Communist Workers Platform of the USA stands with the transit workers and the people who need a system designed for them, not a system that accommodates the interests of capital. In New York City, Mamdani has entered office and in his first few days has passed several executive orders overhauling measures adopted by previous Mayor Eric Adams, such as revoking the Israel-related orders that defined anti-Semitism and blocked city workers and agencies from boycotting or divesting from Israel. Other Mamdani executive orders are targeting junk subscription fees and housing development plans. He has begun the appointment and selection of deputy mayors, judges, and executive directors, as well as the establishment of the Office of Mass Engagement. What is notable about his appointees is Julie Su, who was the acting labor secretary under the Biden administration when it signed an executive order to block a nationwide railroad worker strike. This, in addition to his meeting with over 150 businesses and real estate executives, bankers, tech companies, and business owners prior to taking office, signals exactly what Mamdani promised to the elite, that there will be common ground, there will be dialogue and working together. In other words, Mayor Mamdani takes up the worn-out mantle of social democracy, trying to weld together the interests of the workers with the bosses. The communists find it difficult to strike out against objectively beneficial measures like more affordable housing and transportation, that is, if they even happen. But the idea of working together with the representatives and members of the capitalist class as a way out of a crisis is an idea doomed to fail. The limitations of the capitalist system, in this case, where Mamdani needs the approval of the governor and city council for rent caps, and the threat of the Trump administration to deploy the National Guard or cut funding, make it all to where reforms are a dead end. It has already been stated by Mamdani that he has nothing to do with communism, but rather holds the vision of democratic socialism, which has nothing to do with socialism. It is merely a management system of capitalism, which grants a few crumbs to pacify the indignation of the working class. Fundamental property relations are left untouched. The plans for development of housing, the desire to integrate the tech companies in the improvement of New York State bureaucracy, all signal that profits might be lowered for some, but risen for others. A genuine improvement in the living conditions of the workers is not to be expected from the passing of these first few measures, as signaled by his meeting with figures like the CEO of Pfizer, Jamie Dimon, and Jeffrey Gurral. Capitalism might get a new human face, a prettier, more polished one. Militant potential, which reached new heights with the struggles against ICE and the Palestinian Liberation Movement, will more effectively be channeled into state structures through the so-called outreach and his new office of mass engagement, all to tame the capitalist system. The only real prospect lies in the organizing of the working class, the exposing of the dead ends of reformism, and the revolutionary overthrow of the capitalist system.
This was a presentation of New Worker Radio on WZRD Chicago, 88.3 FM. For more, go to cwp-usa.org or newworker.us.